Good afternoon. My name is Vikas Pota. I'm the founder of T4. We've been actually doing quite a few of these T4 TV live streams this week because there's just so much interesting stuff that's happening that we ought to talk about it. And the thing that today I want to bring forward, and I believe that it goes to the crux of everything that we do, which is around the subject of leadership. We know that leadership makes a difference. Good leaders make a big difference. And it's only really exemplified by my recent experiences when I think about the shortlists for the world's best school prizes and these 50 schools. When I look at the profiles, when I meet with them, when I understand just the impact that they're having, whilst you can talk about certain interventions being successful, you can talk about certain strategies, you can talk about certain investments, but really, when you think about it, it does really come back to 50 incredible school leaders at the same time, and the way they've been able to create change is quite admirable, and we recognize that through the listing process for these prizes. Now, this subject is just so vast, and we thought that we should actually have a more pointed discussion on what are the latest things that we're looking at in terms of school leadership in particular. As I've said in the past, and we'll come to this subject later on today, when I think about all these future of education type of conversations, or as they are now called as transforming education conversations, I think about the true experts in education being school leaders, actually, and actually teachers and those at the coalface of education who, to much dismay, actually, they just don't get a look in when it comes to such humongous moments in time, such as the Transforming Education Summit. And so what I wanted to do was actually bring forward two leaders who run organizations, all focused upon school leadership, to come and tell us in terms of, what is firstly about their organizations, and more importantly, what are the latest things that we need to know about school leadership in different contexts. So please join me in welcoming Azad Oommen. Azad, welcome. Azad is the co-founder and CEO of Global School Leaders. I am honored and privileged to serve on the board of Global School Leaders. And I was actually quite surprised that it's the first time I've invited Azad on here. Azad, welcome. And secondly, I want to invite Wepmen of New Leaders, which is an incredible organization in America that focuses on school leadership, in particular education leadership in America. Both of you are most welcome to this live stream. Without further ado, though, I do want to use this opportunity, because it is our platform, to say a big happy birthday to my colleague Marin, who actually runs the World's Best School Prizes. Marin, 30, is young. We wish you the very best. I'm sure everyone joins us in that. But if we go back to our subject matter now, Noah, tell us a little bit about your organization. Tell us the genesis. Tell us what you've been trying to do. And because of the TV format, keep it brief.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me on here. New Leaders is a nonprofit organization in the United States who develops school leaders who can shape our future. Our leaders remove barriers to success for underestimated and underserved students across the country. We've been at this for over 20 years. Our leaders now serve in 130 districts across 41 states in the United States. We came about this work because, while teachers, of course, have the largest amount of impact on student learnings, we know that are dependent on school leaders, and school leaders are the most scalable intervention that. So we've spent the last 20 years ensuring that there's a diverse pipeline of school leaders in our buildings across the country.
Fantastic. And what actually gave rise to the organization? What was there a genesis? Was there an inflection point? What was it that's so maybe different to today's circumstances?
Yeah, 20 years ago, I think there was a huge amount of attention on education reform. There was the birth and launch of Teach for America, and in some ways, New Leaders became the Teach for America for school leadership, right? Mm-hmm. Bringing in people into the leadership pipeline that may not otherwise have thought about becoming a school leader. So in some ways, while we are not connected, our genesis is an extension of the kind of ideas that led to Teach for America.
And so tell us, in terms of from new leaders, how many school leaders do you have in your network? What is it that you do with them? What services and what kind of support you provide to them?
Yeah, we have worked with over 8,000 leaders now in our 20 years. 60% of those are leaders of color. And in the United States, while 54% of students in our schools are students of color, only 20% right now are leaders of color. And we know, there's a huge difference when students have teachers of color and leaders of color in their building. So we're quite proud that we have been able to, work with 8,000 leaders, and 60% of those are school leaders. We work with them. It's a year-long program to provide coaching, to provide communities of practice to work with through problems of practice with like-minded people in their district. And then once they go through our program, we have a whole series of supports for our alumni, ongoing coaching, supports as they move on to higher levels of leadership, to think about how they go from school level transformation to system levels transformation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And many congratulations to your organization's achievements. Azad, tell everyone and share with everyone, just what is Global School Leaders? What is it that you do? I know it says it, on the tin, as it were, what you are. But talk a little bit about the work, because the organization is not as old as what NOAA runs. And so why don't you share more about the organization?
Yeah. Thanks, Vikas. And first, can I just say congratulations on the wonderful success of the World's Best School Prizes. It's been so inspiring to hear the stories of all these schools from around the world that are just highlighting the importance of good education in these days. So we started Global School Leaders 6 years ago. It came out of a program that I had helped to start in India called the India School Leadership Institute. And really, we were looking at within India at the education system, which, as you can imagine, is a very vast system with over 250 million children, and seeing that there was really no momentum around this issue of school leadership. There was a lot of attention on teachers, but then as teachers became school leaders, there was no support that was being provided to them in their new role. And we felt that that was a hugely underleveraged opportunity to really impact the system. As Noah was saying, the school leader tends to be such a point of leverage to try and improve systems. And as you pointed out, Vikas, when you look at the World's Best School Prizes, all of these schools are driven by leaders. So as at Global School Leaders, we work in low and middle income countries on this issue of school leadership. We do three things. One is we support organizations that are working on training school leaders. So we provide them best-in-class resources, both in terms of program delivery, but also in terms of measurement of impact and things like this. So in that, we are currently partnering with organizations in 5 countries, in Brazil, in Kenya, India, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And we hope to grow that number. This year, I think we'll add another 2 or 3 countries to this. The second thing that we do is we are really focused on surfacing research that emerges from low and middle income countries. As we've seen the field of school leadership that has really been defined by organizations like New Leaders, it's primarily been located in the global north. So countries like the US, UK, Australia, which have had a long history of working on these issues. But what we found in our work is that a lot of this work is not contextualized to the context of low and middle income countries. So we feel like there's a lot of research that has to come out of these countries to say what kinds of school leadership is relevant in these countries. So for instance, like in India, many primary schools don't have school leaders because they're too small. These are 1 or 2 teacher schools. So, but yet they are institutions, and there is leadership in any institution. So we're doing things like looking at these kinds of issues to understand how school leadership plays out in these very different contexts than the way it's traditionally been seen. And then the third thing we're trying to do is to bring together people in a movement around school leadership. So not just training organizations, but also governments, and how are policymakers thinking about school leadership, how are academics thinking about school leadership, and how's philanthropy thinking about school leadership as well. And to really spark people to come together to really look at this issue, because we really feel like this is a hugely addressed issue within the global education ecosystem.
I mean, I want to ask a question to both of you, is that in terms of, what normally gives rise to organizations like yours is failure. Like, otherwise, where is the space for it? But hold that thought. I do want to ask you some questions about that, and why is it that education leaders and government leaders in particular haven't risen to the challenge? But before I do that, I want to just take a moment to just bring on screen some friends who are commenting on all of our social media platforms, and just to say hello to them, and also to show that this is such a global conversation that has a lot of interest. So here we have is Fatma from Egypt, who is a computer science teacher, I believe, right? And a Microsoft innovator at that. You have Amir, who's logging in from Oman. You have Ismat from Bangladesh. You have Sana from Jordan. You have Kalyani, who's a country ambassador in Namaste from India. We have Zura from Libya, Awayemi from Nigeria, Rahman from Egypt, my own colleague Daniel, obviously from Nigeria. And here we go, Joseph Efiong, who is a good friend of ours from Uyo in Nigeria, Afa from Palestine, which is so fantastic. And of course, the birthday girl herself from Buenos Aires. Rahul is, namaste everybody, present here from India. Afreen from UAE. My own colleague, Howdy from London. Briha from Pakistan. And this is just in such a short span of time. People have logged on and taken part, so it's fantastic. Mervat from Jerusalem. Obviously, Buse from Ankara. From Kenya, you have Benson, who has a very good presentation on transforming education and the role of school leadership. Greetings from Kenya, Jambo. My friend Alison Bellwood, who runs the world's largest lesson. Couldn't agree more. Teachers and school leaders are underrepresented. Absolutely. Thanks for joining, Alison. And I'm just thinking, Princess from Egypt. I love the name. Noah from Oman, Ajaz from India, and on it goes. And I'll keep on flashing these up. So if we come back to that question that I started posing, why is it that those people who run education systems have underinvested in school leadership? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I'm going to go to Noah first, if that's okay.
Great, and it's so wonderful to see so many people from far and wide tuning in. So really appreciate being part of the conversation.
You're famous. You're famous. You can tell your mom.
That would be the first thing that I do. She'll be so proud. So the question of why have we either underinvested or not supported school leaders, it's a really good question. And I think, it's actually one that we struggle with at New Leaders, right? We try and build momentum around supporting school leaders, right? You look at any other industry, right? And leadership is paramount, right? The importance of the CEO in private business, even the superintendent in a school system, it is that principle, right? That middle manager almost that gets forgotten. And I think it is because it is that middle manager level, right? There's so much focus on teachers. There are so many teachers in the United States. There are so many teachers who vote, and they provide a constituency for politicians, whereas school leaders less so. I think that there are the incentives coming out of universities to prepare high-performing teachers don't exist, right? The incentive is just to graduate people, and people who go through leadership programs in the United States get their degree so that they can become a principal and receive a salary increase, right? So there's not that accountability to produce great leaders. So I think it is because there's that hidden level, that hidden middle manager that gets forgotten, is why we don't see the investment in leadership. So as an example, in the United States, we spent $18 billion on educator professional development. Of that, about 2% is spent on providers that provide support for education leaders, right? So our federal government on down doesn't provide the funding to do that kind of work. And so it becomes a very lonely job. 40% of school leaders in the last year report being verbally attacked. In the last 2 years, this job has become even more difficult to do. And school leaders don't sign up to be politicians like they've been called on to speak about racial reckoning and social unrest in the United States, right? The political divides are so stark in the United States that it's hard for school leaders. It was a hard job before, and it's an even more difficult job now. And so I think that we're going to find our underinvestment in past years is going to come back to haunt us as we see more principals leaving the principalship. 40% of school leaders report wanting to leave in the next 3 years. So we are at an inflection point that if we don't turn this around, our schools and our students are going to suffer.
And so, Azad, I mean, taking it from there, in terms of, well, what is it that you're seeing among school leaders as we enter this mid-stage of 2022? What are some of the needs that you see in these middle-income contexts, low and middle-income contexts that you work in? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, I would just like to echo everything that Noah said. And it's sort of, we see this strange underinvestment in leadership across the system, right? So it's not just the formal school leader, but as you move up into like district level leadership and things like this, and as you move down into how do you prepare teachers to become school leaders, there's no investment in leadership across the spectrum. So I would very much echo what, and it's a strange inconsistency that actually drives me personally, because I find this illogical, and it seems like, if as humans we're not investing in the future of our children by investing in leadership for that, what else are we doing, right? I think in terms of your question, or the immediate question that you asked, because I think we are seeing three things that are emerging that need urgent attention, that school leaders are struggling with how to deal with. One is this immense learning loss that's happened over the last couple of years. So many, in some of the countries in which we work, say the Philippines, where we're doing some work, in India, schools have been closed for more than a year in some parts of these countries, for more than 2 years in some parts of these countries. And how do we catch kids up to and the system hasn't really, these education systems haven't really come up with a way of figuring out how to catch up kids, right? And so then how do school leaders who are sitting at a school level, at a micro level, how are they going to respond to this when the system itself hasn't figured out a way? But these are very, very significant challenges for school leaders to deal with, in terms of figuring out how to get their kids caught up to where they should be. And this was on top of already low learning levels in these countries in which we work. The second thing we're hearing a lot about are mental health challenges, both among students, but also among the teaching staff, as well as among school leaders themselves, feeling stressed. I think Noah touched upon this, but I think when you ask school leaders, they talk a lot about children being out of school, being depressed, not knowing, having missed out on the socialization of being in the classroom. So I think that's a second thing that they're dealing with. And then I think the third thing, which I just briefly touched upon, is that, as education systems in these countries, we're being very slow to react to the crisis that we're facing in education, right? So we're basically like, most countries have just said, okay, let's open up schools, let's bring kids back to school, and we'll see how it plays out. So there isn't like a deliberate approach to saying, we've been through these 2 years of disruption, and how are we going to react to this disruption, and what kind of leadership do we have to show to react to this disruption? So there's very little policy level discussions around these. In my opinion, the policy reaction has just been, let's open up the schools and see what happens. And I think there needs to be much more deliberate support that's being provided to school leaders, to teachers, to deal with these systemic issues that are being confronted in these countries.
And so, Noah, when you hear about all these challenges, and I'm sure you're pretty familiar with the things that Azad is saying, even in an American context, what are the really interesting policy developments around increasing support for school leaders in America, as an example?
So what are the interesting policy developments, you asked? there have not been a ton, at least at the federal level. There's been a huge investment in our school systems, right? The federal government has put in billions upon billions of dollars to support schools and systems recover from the pandemic, right? As Azad said, right, the unfinished learning that students are experiencing to provide for tutoring, money to try and recruit teachers back into the profession. 70% of teachers, of school leaders report staffing shortage going into the school year. So, while there has not been a lot of policy development specifically focused at school leaders, I am optimistic that there will be. I think that our current leadership recognizes the need for strong school leaders. And I'm hopeful that in the next year or so, we will see some policy supports, both in how do we recruit and bring teachers and other education leaders into that leadership pipeline, and how do we support those leaders, providing social emotional supports, for example, right? These school leaders, right, they're in charge of providing social emotional supports to their students, to their faculty, and often they are, themselves are the last people that they deal with to provide their support. So I think that we may see some funding at the federal level to provide that kind of social emotional support specifically for school leaders.
And Azad, in your work internationally, I mean, who's doing anything interesting in this space?
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like in the last couple of years, the role of school leaders has really emerged. Because I think when the pandemic happened and schools shut, school leaders were the ones who had to keep education going. So they had to figure out how to get teachers involved, how to keep kids coming to school. So I think because of that focus on, or because school leaders emerged as such critical players, which some of us already knew they were, but I think the larger ecosystem started to realize that they are very critical. There's been a lot more interest in this. So with organizations like the World Bank and UNESCO, the Teacher Task Force at UNESCO, we've been running communities of practice, running some webinars around this to bring people together to discuss this. But I think we're also seeing within philanthropy some really interesting initiatives around school leadership. So for instance, we've just launched an area of work around school leadership and gender equity. So as there was a lot of fear around girls being at the short end of the learning losses that were faced over the last couple of years, and as we looked at that, as we looked at ways in which we could address that, one of the things we saw was that a lot of the efforts around girls' education have been focused on teachers and girls' education. So now we've just launched an area of work around school leadership and gender equity. We're doing some work around school leadership and foundational literacy and numeracy. So I think there's much more interest now in saying, how do we overlay the investments that we've made in teachers with an investment in leadership to really turbocharge the efforts that we've made in teachers? So this we're seeing as emerging fledgling efforts. But I think globally, when you talk about it, like at this upcoming Transforming Education Summit in New York, there's very little focus on school leadership, right? So we've just fought to try and get a mention here and there. Whereas there's obviously a huge focus on teachers in this, but I think the larger ecosystem still has to catch up to the idea that for a relatively small investment in school leaders, you can really boost the efforts that you're making with teachers.
And so, what would be your message, Noah, to this big summit that's taking place in September around transforming education?
My message would be, my hope would be that anytime there's a conversation focusing on teachers, that conversation becomes something on teachers and leaders. Those two things go hand in hand. They work best when they are coupled and working together. So any conversation that includes any policy statements around teachers is expanded to include teachers and leaders.
And Azad, what about you? I mean, I think you're going to the summit. What do you have to say in terms of, you've been banging the drum for quite some time. What's your message to the delegates of the Transforming Education Summit?
Yeah, I would just say that, look, school leadership is a small investment relative to the investment we're making in teachers, but it's such a critical investment. And I would add to what Noah is saying to say that actually the needs of school leaders are somewhat different than the needs of teachers. So in as much as we should talk about them together, there also needs to be a very deliberate focus on leadership because it's a very different job function, right? It's not, you're not in the classroom, you're actually managing teachers, things like this. So the pressures that school leaders face are so important. And I would just urge the delegates of this summit to remember at the beginning of the pandemic who are the ones holding this whole thing together, right? And it was school leaders. And how do we acknowledge that role, and how do we honor and respect that role by making a greater investment in them now?
Azad, what gives you confidence that they're listening?
Well, I know you're a popular guy, Vikas, so I'm assuming that they're all tuned into the show.
It's a great way of sidestepping the question. I want to put up some questions and some comments by other people, but in conclusion, I do want to take you back to a very personal experience, if you can. When you think about leaders, I often think about one or two people in my mind from my history and people I know. And I want to ask you to name someone, if you can, from that exemplifies all the things about leadership that you talk about. But let's look at some of the comments. Jasmine says Noah's points about underinvestment serve as a good reminder for all stakeholders to invest in school leaders. Gail, hi from South Africa. This is a pretty straightforward question. We also have looked at think tank sessions and how about SMTs as well in schools. Then we go on to there's another comment over here from Briha. So same is the situation in Pakistan. Most of the teachers don't want to be a school leader, and those who are appointed as leaders trying to leave their jobs because of the immense pressure. At least there should be some project for school leaders' mental well-being. And so those are pretty robust comments that have been made. Noah, come back to the final question which I had. Who inspires you?
Yeah. Who inspires me is a leader named Cleve Bryant. Cleve Bryant was actually my literature teacher when I was in high school. And he inspired me. I was new to the school, was not doing my best academically, and he pushed me and challenged me to be my best. A few years later, many years later, when I was in a leadership role at a school system, I ran into Cleve Bryant, who was then the principal of the high school. He remembered me. He told me how proud he was of what I had accomplished since that time in high school. And I saw that he brought joy into the school and into the classroom. And then I had the opportunity to see him interact with his teachers and see that line from him being that amazing teacher who pushed students, who inspired students, to doing the same for the teachers in that building. And it brought me great joy, great hope, great optimism for that entire school community.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Azad?
Yeah, I would highlight the example of a school leader who we've interacted a lot with at Global School Leaders. Her name is Sarita Nair. She's from Pune in Maharashtra in India. And she first came to our attention in the early days of the pandemic when she was one of those school leaders who just said, we need to make sure that as a leader in the community, we need to make sure that the community is cared for. And she really did a lot in terms of making a school a community hub, taking care of school, of not just the children, but their families as well, and raising money, making sure there were resources flowing to them. That role has continued in terms of viewing her school as a community hub. But for us, what's been really amazing has been how she's now become a part of the global conversation. She just recently had the opportunity to interview another school leader, Ziauddin Yousafzai, Malala's dad, who was a school leader himself for many years in Pakistan. And they had a wonderful conversation as part of this series we're launching at Global School Leaders called In the Principal's Office, where we're interviewing interesting education folks about their experiences with their principals. So now she's a part of this global conversation, and I think for us it's just highlighting the role. She exemplifies how we can highlight the role of school leaders, and based on the really wonderful work that they're doing.
Thank you for sharing both. There is this one question that's come up, which I think we should address before we sign off, from a gentleman called Glyn. One of the most valuable supports for school leaders and others is a mentor. What support for this process is in hand in your countries? Can we conclude on that point? Do you want to go first, Noah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that we're doing in New Leaders, as I said, providing support for our alumni. And what we have found in the last year, principals want that support, that mentor, that coaching, someone that they can talk to both share what's going on in their building and get support, get ideas, that we as new leaders have the opportunity to know what's going on in effective school leadership across the country. So we can bring that knowledge, effective practices from across the country, and support individuals in their work. So I think that providing that one-on-one coaching, and the more that we can do that and provide that to leaders across the country, the better.
Rather than answer that question, I thought this is a really good question that's come up, Azad. You can finish on this one. How can I be an amazing teacher?
Be a part of the T4 community and really just draw upon the amazing resources that it's providing. No, I mean, on a serious note, I think...
you are being serious. Don't lie.
Yeah. But I think, just to tag on to what Noah was saying, I think we've seen a couple of different ways in which we can introduce this idea of mentorship. One is around peer networks and how do school leaders support each other, because that tends to be a very lonely job. And the other is to look at how do you empower school leader supervisor level people to become coaches as opposed to being administrative sort of checks on the teachers. So that's something that we're working on as well. But I think in terms of becoming an amazing teacher, I think the best thing to do would be to be a part of a community where you'll find other amazing teachers. And to put in another plug for T4, please, I think they have really wonderful communities, and be a part of that.
Well, thank you, Noah. Thank you, Azad, for taking your time out today to be with us here today. I know, Noah, you're in Seattle. Azad, you're in LA, a long way away from the rest of the world. And we thank you for taking moments out of your morning to have this conversation. We hope to have you back in the future. Please know that I am very grateful, and the T4 community is very grateful. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.